Picture yourself walking the narrow streets of Istanbul 5 centuries ago. The air is heavy with the scent of spice and smoke, the murmur of merchants and sailors, the rustle of silks from far-off lands. And then a new aroma, dark, earthy, inviting, drifts through the crowd. Coffee. It began as a stranger from Yemen, carried on camelbacks and ships. But soon it became the very heartbeat of the Ottoman world. From hidden alleys to grand bazaars, from the whispers of poets to the murmurs of soldiers, the Kavahane, the coffee house, emerged as the empire's stage. This is the story of how a simple drink transformed society. A story of conversation and connection, of danger and delight. A story where empires met, not on battlefields, but across wooden tables with porcelain cups in hand. Tonight, we journey into the smoke-filled rooms of the Ottoman Coffeehouse, where history was not written in ink, but spoken in voices and carried on the rising steam of coffee. Close your eyes and imagine the streets of Istanbul in the mid-16th century. The air is rich with the perfume of saffron, musk, and rosewater, yet a new fragrance lingers. A dark, earthy scent that drifts through the markets, stronger, bolder, unfamiliar. This was the aroma of coffee, freshly arrived from Yemen, carried by traders across the Red Sea, destined to change the empire forever. At first, coffee was a curiosity, poured only in private homes among the wealthy. But soon, it leapt into the public sphere, where its true power would be revealed. In 1554, 2 merchants from Aleppo and Damascus opened the first coffee house in Istanbul. It was a place unlike any other, not a tavern, not a mosque, not a marketplace, but something new. Within its wooden walls, men sat side by side, sipping from tiny porcelain cups. Their minds awakened, their tongues loosened. Conversation flourished, and a new kind of gathering was born. The Ottoman Kavahane, the social hive. Inside the coffee house, the air shimmered with smoke from braziers. Tables overflowed with men playing backgammon, poets reciting verses, and scholars debating law and philosophy. Here, all classes blended, the artisan with the merchant, the janissary with the scholar. Storytellers, called meta, became the stars of these spaces. With a simple stick or handkerchief, they transformed into kings, tricksters, and fools, weaving satire and parables that made their listeners laugh, reflect, and sometimes quietly revel. Music filled the air, too. The twang of the saz, the deep hum of the oud, the voice of folk poets singing of love, loss, and faith. More than leisure, this was education. News traveled here before it reached the palace scribes. The illiterate learned through listening. The lonely found companionship. The curious found wisdom. The Kavahane became the empire's stage, its classroom, its parliament. But the authorities noticed. They saw the power of these gatherings, the way men whispered about reforms, mocked officials in veiled jokes, or rallied together in solidarity. Sultan Murad IV, stern and ruthless, decided to act. He banned coffee, closing coffee houses, punishing drinkers with brutal severity. Some offenders, it was said, were hurled into the Bosphorus. And yet, the bans never lasted. People brewed in secret, gathering behind shuttered doors, their conversations hushed but unbroken. Coffee had become too deeply tied to the Ottoman spirit. When one Kavahane closed, another appeared down the street. For every punishment handed down, 1,000 cups still simmered in hidden kitchens. Eventually, rulers realized they could not kill the Kavahane. They could only control it. Coffee houses were taxed, monitored, and infiltrated by informers. But even under watchful eyes, they remained what they had always been, places where the empire's pulse could be felt most clearly. Yet for the Ottomans, coffee was never just commerce. It was ritual. The sez pot, the rising foam, the delicate cups. It was an art of patience, a ceremony of respect. To offer coffee to a guest was to honor them. To decline was almost an insult. In the palace, the ritual was elevated into spectacle. The Sultan's chief coffee maker oversaw every detail, serving cups on golden trays with sweets and incense. Beyond the palace, coffee entered the most intimate corners of life. In marriage rituals, a bride-to-be served her suitor coffee, sometimes salted instead of sweet, to test his patience and character. For mystics, coffee was spiritual. Sufi dervishes drank it during long nights of prayer, believing it awakened both mind and soul. And among the people, a playful tradition of fortune-telling emerged, reading the dark patterns left by coffee grounds at the bottom of a cup. In its bitterness, coffee carried laughter, hospitality, and mystery. The Kavahain was not the same everywhere. In Damascus, coffee houses bloomed in gardens, with fountains and poets reciting under moonlight. In Aleppo, they were hubs of trade, buzzing with merchants striking deals. In Cairo, they echoed with music and theater, vibrant with the city's energy. In Baghdad, the culture took on its own life. Coffee houses spread along the Tigris, their lanterns glowing on the water. They became not just places of leisure, but of politics and organization. Soldiers met there, reformers gathered there, and storytellers filled the air with epics from 1001 Nights. Coffee houses in Baghdad shaped not only conversation, but movements that would echo into the 20th century. From the Balkans to Arabia, each region molded the Kavahain to its needs, but the essence remained the same, a place of talk, of community, of belonging. As the 19th century wore on, the Ottoman Empire weakened. Borders shrank, revolutions stirred, and European powers pressed in. In the coffee houses, the conversations grew bolder. Men no longer whispered only about taxes or ministers. They dreamed of independence, reform, and nations yet unborn. Though the empire eventually fell, the Kavahain endured. Some transformed into modern cafes with glass windows and marble tables. Others remained simple, smoky, and timeless. Turkish coffee itself was enshrined as a cultural treasure, recognized by UNESCO as a heritage of humanity. And beyond the former empire, the legacy was immense. From Vienna's grand cafes to the corner coffee shops of Paris and London, even to the bustling cafes of New York and Buenos Aires, the spirit of the Ottoman Kavahain lives on. It is the spirit of gathering, of conversation, of ideas shared over a simple cup. Close your eyes and imagine the streets of Istanbul in the mid-16th century. The air is thick with the perfume of spices, cinnamon, saffron, and musk drifting from the markets. But mingling with them, something new stirs, a dark, earthy fragrance, unfamiliar yet irresistible. This was the scent of kav, coffee, arriving from the mountains of Yemen, carried across the Red Sea by merchants who knew they were bringing not just a drink, but a revolution. At first, coffee was exotic, a curiosity sipped only in private gatherings among the wealthy and the scholarly. But soon, its power could not be contained. Coffee was more than warmth in a cup. It sharpened the mind, opened the tongue, and seemed to dissolve the barriers of class. A shepherd might share a bench with a scholar, a craftsman with a poet. Conversation bloomed like the smoke of a brazier, rising freely, unhindered. And so, in the year 1554, two men, merchants from Aleppo and Damascus, opened the first public kavahain in Istanbul. The city had never seen anything like it. Within those wooden walls, men sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping from small porcelain cups, their eyes alight as they played chess, debated politics, or simply watched the world pass by. The kavahain was not a tavern, not a mosque, not a market. It was something new, a place where the empire itself seemed to pause, lean in, and listen. The authorities, at first, looked on with curiosity. Coffee houses were places of gathering, but also places of energy, too much energy. Preachers warned that idleness lurked within their walls. Sultans feared whispers of sedition, and yet coffee spread like wildfire, impossible to control. By the early 17th century, there were hundreds of coffee houses in Istanbul alone, each one a hive of activity. The storytellers, the meta, became fixtures of the kavahain. With only a handkerchief and a stick, they transformed into kings, tricksters, lovers, and fools, spinning tales that captivated audiences for hours. The coffee house became a stage, a classroom, and a parliament all in one. Here, news from far-off corners of the empire was traded like coin. Here, rumors became movements. Coffee itself carried symbolism. Unlike wine, it did not intoxicate. Instead, it sharpened. Unlike tea, which would later conquer the empire, coffee required ceremony. The grounds, the sez pot, the bubbling foam, all were rituals of patience and precision. To drink coffee was to enter a rhythm, a ritual, a shared experience. Yet with growth came danger. Sultan Murad IV, a ruler known for his severity, viewed coffee houses with suspicion. To him, they were breeding grounds for disorder, places where men plotted treason beneath the cover of smoke. His response was brutal. Coffee houses were shut down, their patrons punished, their owners drowned in the Bosphorus as examples. But even the iron fist of a sultan could not strangle the bean. Coffee had become part of the empire's very heartbeat. If a kavahain was closed in one district, another sprang up in the next. Even when prohibition reigned, men brewed in secret, gathering quietly in shadowed rooms to sip, to talk, to dream. For by then, the kavahain was no longer just about coffee. It was about freedom, freedom to speak, to argue, to imagine. And in a world where authority pressed down from palace and pulpit, that freedom was as intoxicating as any wine. Step through the wooden doors of an Ottoman coffee house in the 17th century, and you enter a world alive with sound. The air is thick with smoke from braziers, curling upward in gray-blue ribbons. The tables are crowded with men leaning forward, voices rising and falling in heated debate. Someone rolls dice on a backgammon board. In the corner, a poet recites lines of mystical verse, his voice trembling like a reed flute. The kavahain was not simply a place to drink coffee. It was a salon of the people. In palaces, only the elite could gather. In mosques, only prayers could be spoken. But here, in the dim lamplight of a coffee house, all classes blended. The artisan, the shopkeeper, the scholar, and the janissary sat shoulder to shoulder, cups clinking softly in unison. News traveled faster here than anywhere else. A ship arriving in the Golden Horn would be known in the coffee house before word reached the palace scribes. Travelers brought tales of distant lands, and soldiers brought rumors of campaigns. The coffee house became the empire's memory, its tongue, its pulse. The meta, the storytellers, were the kings of these spaces. With a simple prop, a stick that became a sword, a beard, or a crown, they could embody dozens of characters. They told tales of Nasreddin Hoja, the trickster philosopher who mocked authority with wit. They spun sagas of Alexander the Great, or legends of prophets and saints. Their voices wove laughter, sorrow, and suspense, holding entire rooms captive. To listen to a meta was to be educated as well as entertained. The audience learned history, morality, and politics, all cloaked in fable. Satire flourished in these performances. A clever joke could disguise a sharp criticism of the Sultan or his ministers, hidden in plain sight. Everyone understood, but no one could accuse the teller outright. In this way, the Kavahain became a theater of subtle resistance. Music too had its place. The strumming of the saz, the plucking of the oud, and the haunting voice of folk poets, the assicler, filled the smoky air. Verse and melody mingled with the bitterness of coffee, stirring hearts and minds alike. But perhaps the greatest cultural gift of the coffee house was its creation of a public sphere. Here, identity was shaped not by decree, but by dialogue. Men debated faith and philosophy, argued about the law, and discussed the actions of viziers and sultans. Even those who could not read gained knowledge by listening, their understanding sharpened by the chorus of voices around them. Some scholars compared the Kavahain to the ancient Greek agora, a place where the city found its voice. Others likened it to a university, where wisdom was passed not through books, but through conversation. For the common man of the Ottoman Empire, the coffee house was both. And so, in the dim light of oil lamps, over cups of strong, bitter coffee, a society was being formed. A society of talkers, thinkers, listeners, of citizens. The empire's rulers may not have realized it then, but in the simple act of gathering for a drink, a quiet revolution of thought was already brewing. The coffee house was more than a social stage. It was a parliament of the streets. Within its smoky walls, men spoke more freely than anywhere else in the empire. Here, conversations turned sharper, more daring. Questions whispered at a bazaar were debated openly over a cup of coffee. The janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire, were frequent visitors. Their loyalty was to the Sultan, but also to one another, and the Kavahain gave them a place to gather beyond the barracks. They played backgammon, but they also planned. They joked loudly, but between jokes, they murmured grievances about pay, provisions, or orders. These conversations could swell into movements, and movements could become revolts. It was said that when trouble stirred in the empire, you could hear the first echoes in a coffee house long before they reached the palace. The Kavahain was not just a mirror of society, it was its sounding board. The authorities understood this power, and they feared it. Under Sultan Murad IV in the early 1600s, coffee houses became targets of suspicion. Murad, known for his severity, believed they were breeding grounds of sedition. He banned coffee entirely, punishing not only the sellers, but even those who dared to sip in secret. The punishments were harsh. Some accounts speak of repeat offenders being hurled into the Bosphorus, their bodies swallowed by the dark waters as a warning. The Kavahain was watched closely, informers sent to sit quietly in corners, listening for signs of rebellion hidden in casual talk. And yet, the bans never lasted. The people's love for coffee was too strong, and the lure of conversation too irresistible. Even when doors were shuttered, coffee houses continued in whispers, in private rooms, in hidden corners of the city. The empire could outlaw the bean, but could not outlaw the thirst for connection. Ironically, rulers soon realized that suppressing the coffee house only strengthened its mystique. The bans gave coffee houses an aura of defiance, as though each sip was an act of rebellion. Eventually, the authorities changed tactics. Rather than destroy the Kavahain, they taxed and regulated it. By doing so, they transformed it into a space both feared and tolerated, a pressure valve for the empire. Still, suspicion lingered. In times of unrest, officials whispered, "Go to the coffee houses and you will hear the empire's pulse." The Coffeehouse was no longer just a stage for poets and storytellers. It was an unofficial parliament, a place where voices rose against injustice, where ideas bloomed into action. And so, in the glow of oil lamps, the coffee house became a paradox. It was both a space of leisure and a space of danger, a place where empires tried to silence dissent, yet also a place where the seeds of change could never truly be buried. Coffee was more than a drink. It was commerce, wealth, and empire. The beans came first from Yemen, carried by camel caravans across deserts to the port of Mocha. From there, Ottoman ships ferried them northward up the Red Sea into the beating heart of Istanbul. By the late 16th century, coffee had become a thriving trade. Merchants grew rich not only from the bean itself, but from the culture it created. The Ottoman capital buzzed with hundreds of coffee houses, each one requiring steady supplies of beans, cups, sugar, charcoal, and furniture. An entire economy swirled around the Coffeehouse, feeding artisans, shopkeepers, and sailors alike. To sip coffee in Istanbul was not just to taste a drink. It was to taste the lifeblood of global trade, the long reach of an empire connecting Arabia, Africa, and Europe. As coffee houses flourished, so too did their influence beyond Ottoman borders. Venetian traders, always hungry for new luxuries, carried coffee across the Mediterranean. At first, Europeans regarded it with suspicion. Some called it the bitter invention of Satan. Yet when Pope Clement VIII tasted it, he is said to have declared, "This drink is so delicious, it would be a sin to let only infidels enjoy it." From Venice, coffee spread to London, Paris, Vienna, and beyond. European coffee houses, modeled after the Ottoman Coffeehouse, quickly became centers of intellectual life. They were nicknamed penny universities because for the price of a cup, a man could sit for hours listening to scholars, merchants, and philosophers debate. And so, what began in Yemen and blossomed in Istanbul soon transformed Europe's own public life, fueling the Enlightenment, revolutions, and the birth of newspapers. Back in the Ottoman heartlands, coffee remained a source of both pride and power. By the early 17th century, Istanbul alone was said to have over 600 coffee houses, each one alive with conversation and clinking porcelain cups. Travelers marveled at the variety. Some were grand and ornate, serving elite patrons beneath painted ceilings. Others were humble, where fishermen and porters shared news over steaming brews. The empire understood coffee's importance. Customs officers taxed every shipment, ensuring revenue for the state. Sultans appointed a kavasibisi, or chief coffee maker, at court, an honored position that oversaw not only brewing but ceremony, hospitality, and the delicate politics of serving. Coffee was no longer just a habit. It was empire. It was diplomacy. It was global. To drink coffee in the Ottoman world was never a hurried act. It was ceremony. In homes, in palaces, in coffee houses. The ritual mattered as much as the taste. The beans were roasted slowly over open fire, their fragrance filling the room. Then, ground to a fine powder, they were brewed in the small copper pot known as the sezv. As the water bubbled and frothed, the foam rose gently, a sign of patience and skill. The coffee was poured into small porcelain cups without handles, delicate, almost fragile, nestled in ornate metal holders. Sugar might be added, but never milk. Strong, thick, and slightly bitter, it was sipped slowly, almost reverently. It was more than a drink. It was a pause in time, a shared silence, a moment of reflection. Hospitality revolved around this ritual. To offer coffee to a guest was an act of respect. To refuse, it was almost an insult. Even the poorest household would find a way to serve coffee, for in its bitterness lay a sweetness of welcome. In the Ottoman palace, coffee reached its highest refinement. The Sultan's court employed a special official, the Kavasibasi, or chief coffee maker, who held a trusted and prestigious role. To prepare the Sultan's coffee was not merely service. It was ceremony, a duty woven with symbolism and trust. The palace ritual was precise. Coffee was presented on golden trays, accompanied by sweet confections, and sometimes perfumed with cardamom or clove. The act of drinking became a dance of etiquette, where every gesture conveyed meaning. The Sultan's cup was a mirror of empire itself, ornate, dignified, and carefully guarded. Even beyond the palace, families incorporated coffee into their most intimate traditions. When a suitor visited the home of a prospective bride, the girl would prepare and serve coffee for him and his family. In this ritual, a test awaited. Sometimes, the bride would add salt instead of sugar to the groom's cup. If he drank without complaint, it showed patience, humility, and devotion, virtues prized in a husband. Coffee even slipped into the mystical. Among the Sufis, who sought closeness with the divine, it was seen as a drink that awakened the mind and heart during long nights of prayer and chanting. For them, coffee was not simply worldly, it was spiritual, a helper on the path to God. Over time, fortune-telling grew around it as well. When a guest finished their cup, the thick grounds at the bottom were turned upside down on the saucer, leaving mysterious shapes. Skilled readers claimed to see symbols in the dark residue, signs of love, wealth, or warning, whether believed in earnest or enjoyed as playful entertainment. This practice made coffee not only a ritual of the present moment, but also a window into the imagined future. Thus, in every corner of Ottoman life, from palace to humble home, from mosque to mystic lodge, coffee was never just a drink. It was a ritual, a symbol, a story told in every sip. Though Istanbul was the beating heart of the empire, the culture of the coffee house stretched far beyond its shores. In Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, coffee houses rose as quickly as minarets, each with a local soul shaped by the rhythms of its city. In Damascus, coffee houses were known for their gardens, shaded with vines and fountains, where poets recited under the open sky. In Aleppo, they became centers for merchants, where deals were struck and caravans planned. And in Cairo, the Kavahain thrived in the shadows of bazaars, echoing with the songs of street performers and the laughter of common folk. Across the empire, from the Balkans to Arabia, each city shaped the coffee house to its own needs. In Sarajevo, they became bastions of Bosnian identity, places where local songs and customs were preserved. In Mecca and Medina, coffee houses often had a religious tint, filled with pilgrims and scholars sharing reflections after prayer. This diversity was the strength of the Ottoman coffee house. It was not a rigid institution, but a living, breathing organism adapting to its soil. Whether in grand imperial Istanbul, mercantile Aleppo, scholarly Baghdad, or provincial towns, the Kavahain carried the same essence: conversation, connection, community. By the dawn of the 20th century, as the empire weakened, the coffee house had already outlived politics and power. It had become a cultural inheritance, woven into the daily life of millions, evolving with every city, every tongue, every story to be why the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Borders shrank, revolts simmered, and European powers pressed at every frontier. Yet, within the dimly lit Kavahain, the cups were still poured, the dice still rattled, and the stories still unfolded. But the tone had changed. Where once men debated the policies of sultans with guarded words, now they spoke of independence, reform, and nationalism. In the coffee houses of Salonika, of Beirut, of Damascus, whispers of freedom moved like smoke through the air. These are no longer simply gatherings of leisure. They had become places where the idea of a future beyond empire was imagined. Still, even as politics darkened, the rituals of the Kavahain held steady. The Sez still bubbled, the foam still rose, and men still leaned across tables to trade stories and laughter. Even in decline, the coffee house clung to its essence, connection. As the Ottoman world gave way to modern nation-states, many of the old coffee houses faded. New cafes, inspired by European styles, emerged with chairs, marble tables, and glass windows. They were brighter, more modern, less smoky. Some mourned the passing of the old Kavahain, with its shadowy corners and murmured tales. Yet the tradition did not vanish, it transformed. In Turkey, Turkish coffee remained a symbol of hospitality and identity, strong and unchanging. In the Balkans, Bosnian and Serbian coffee houses preserved their unique flavors. In the Arab world, Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo still echoed with the chatter of coffee drinkers, blending ancient rhythms with modern life. And beyond the former empire, the legacy was even greater. Europe's cafes, whether in Paris, London, or Vienna, have been born from the Ottoman Coffeehouse. And through Europe, coffee houses would eventually shape the very idea of the modern public sphere, a place where people meet, speak, write, and dream. Today, UNESCO recognizes Turkish coffee as part of humanity's cultural heritage. To sip it is to taste centuries of history, of caravans and sultans, of poets and janissaries, of whispers and laughter drifting through smoky rooms. The Kavahain may no longer hold the empire's pulse, but its spirit lives on every time coffee is shared among friends. In every corner of the modern world, from a bustling cafe in Paris to a quiet tea house in Sarajevo, from the hookah lounges of Cairo to the trendy coffee bars of New York, the echo of the Ottoman coffee house remains. It is the echo of conversation, of stories, of the human need to gather and be heard. And so, though the empire has long since fallen, its gift endures. Not in marble palaces, not in faded decrees, but in the simple act of sitting together, cup in hand, letting words flow like coffee, warm, strong, and unending. The Ottoman coffee house was more than walls and tables, more than beans and cups. It was where voices met, where stories were told, where empires were both celebrated and quietly questioned. It was the heartbeat of a civilization, sometimes gentle, sometimes restless, but always alive. And even now, when you lift a cup of coffee to your lips, you share in that legacy. A legacy born in smoky rooms of Istanbul, carried across deserts and seas, and kept alive wherever people gather, sip, and speak. The empire has fallen. The palaces are silent, but the coffee house endures, its aroma drifting through time, reminding us that sometimes the simplest acts, sharing a drink, telling a story, are the ones that shape the world. And so, the lamps of the old Ottoman coffee houses have long since dimmed, their storytellers gone, their whispers faded into the past. The empire itself has fallen, its palace is silent, but the legacy remains. Every time a cup of Turkish coffee is poured, every time people gather to talk, to laugh, to dream, the spirit of the Kavahain breathes again. It was never just a drink. It was conversation. It was community. It was the pulse of an empire. And those centuries have passed, The echo of those smoky rooms still lingers in every sip, in every story, in every shared silence. The Ottoman Coffeehouse lives on, not in stone, not in decree, but in the warmth of a cup passed from one hand to another.